This talk was first presented at the 13th European Conference on Video Game, Music and Sound, otherwise known as Ludo 2024, which was held in Barcelona in July 2024. I'm Richard Stevens and I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my colleague Dave Raybould. We're founders of the Game Audio Symposium. We've written a couple of books about game audio implementation, and some of you may know us from our work with Epic Games, where we produced 6 courses and documentation about the audio side of Unreal Engine. In video games, there's often lots of audio vying for attention, meaning that the mix is a very crowded space, and as Collins puts it, if we're not careful, this can lead to a sonic logjam. So what do we do to mitigate this, and what could we do? In 2007, Grimshaw suggested that we could consider the audio in the first-person shooter to be an acoustic ecology. The term acoustic ecology was coined by Schaefer in the 60s, coming out of the work of the Wild Soundscape project, and has since been most significantly developed by Bernie Krause, the wildlife sound recordist. Within an acoustic ecology, we can define 3 types of sound. The biophony, sounds produced by organisms or fauna, and by fauna I mean all forms of animal life. Geophony, sound produced by natural, non-biological causes, such as avalanches, earthquakes, glaciers or tides. And anthropophony, sounds with human origin. And of course these, together with other aspects of the environment or abiotic factors, all interact in various ways. In terms of acoustic ecologies, the world has been mixing for a very long time, so maybe there are lessons to be learnt. This talk is going to use acoustic ecology as a lens to look at the audio domains of amplitude, space, frequency and time to see how game audio does and does not take on board some of these lessons. We will deal with these domains separately for clarity, but much of what we're talking about is interrelated. When I speak to you today, my speech of course is not the same as it would be if we were in an intimate conversation. The amplitude and tone of my voice is going to reflect the social situation and the audio environment. If I were talking to you in a noisy bar, or if a helicopter flew overhead while I was speaking, my voice would naturally and automatically get louder. This is known as the Lombard effect, the involuntary tendency of speakers to increase their vocal effort when speaking against background noise, and it's not unique to humans. It has been observed in other primates, cats, bats and whales, for example in the sound generated by beluga whales in response to shipping noise. So is this phenomenon of acoustic ecology present in games? Listen out for the phrase, well, all right. So historically, no, it isn't. You can hear that even in a really noisy environment, the dialogue amplitude and tone did not change. The trouble is that non-player characters, or what I'm going to refer to as actors, in games do not actually hear anything in any real sense. You might be aware in some games where the noise you make appears to have an impact on the world. In Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, the weapon fire appears to scare the fauna into silence, and then after a short period they return to activity. And ever since Doom in 1993, and more obviously in Metal Gear Solid and Thief the Dark Project in 1998, you have NPCs or actors in the games that apparently hear the player. However, in all these examples the game is not hearing in any conventional sense, it's just using a system of triggers as a proxy for hearing. Is the gun firing equals false, play bird sounds. Is the gun firing equals true, play birds flying off sound, wait 30 seconds, then test again. Or in the case of Metal Gear Solid and Thief, has an event tagged as being sound making happened within a given distance of an NPC. Here's a demonstration of how new real-time audio analysis tools in games might enable us to adopt this simple lesson from acoustic ecology. In-game actors could hear the environment and adjust the amplitude and tone of their speech accordingly. For this demo, we've recorded two versions of dialogue, a normal one and a slightly louder one. These lines are held in two arrays, and we monitor the submix, which is playing back all of the sounds in the environment. When a given threshold is passed, in this case when a tank appears, we switch to using the louder dialogue version. So I was just taking a nice walk in the forest when suddenly, completely out of nowhere, this tank appears. It really is the strangest thing. And then, to add to the weirdness, it disappears again, this massive tank. I think I must be losing my tiny mind. This is relatively cheap in terms of the real-time processing required to monitor the background noise, but of course really expensive in terms of having to record multiple versions of all the dialogue in the game. It's probably worth pursuing in terms of its potential enhancement of realism and immersion, and probably only a matter of time before we can use real-time vocal processing based on AI models to manipulate the original dialogue lines, instead of having to record new ones. Already there's technology out there that can approximate this, and there's probably a significant ethical debate we can have about that at a later stage. By looking at game audio through the lens of acoustic ecology, we can start with one takeaway. The real world uses the Lombard effect. Humans and animals adapt to the background noise of the environment. By implementing systems where our actors can actually hear in games, in terms of being conscious of this audio environment, we could make our games feel more authentic and immersive. Of course, when I'm speaking to you, the other thing I'm doing is adjusting my voice to the space we're in. The acoustic adaptation hypothesis states that the acoustic properties of species vocalizations will have been selected to mitigate or leverage the features of their habitat in order to maximize transmission. And I'll explain the Austrian in a minute. The first example of acoustic adaptation we'll talk about is how fauna adapts to the geography of their habitat. Elephants require extensive areas of land in order to meet their needs. For example, the home range of the African elephant has been estimated at more than 15,000 square kilometers. Because of the need to communicate over long distances, elephants have adapted to use infrasound, sound beneath the range of human hearing, to communicate. These low-frequency sounds, below 20 Hz, have longer wavelengths and so are less absorbed in air. They pass through objects with less reflection and diffract around obstacles more effectively. This allows them to propagate across the territory with less loss of energy. Elk and baboons have adapted to the geography of their habitat in a slightly different way. They will choose specific locations with highly reverberant qualities to vocalize in, so that the echo and transmission of their calls creates an illusion of extending their territory. The acoustic properties of a habitat also affects the types of sounds that fauna produce. For example, Naguib et al. Discuss how bird vocalizations differ between rapidly modulating sounds or trills and more slowly modulating, more tonal sounds or whistles, depending on the reverberant nature of their habitat. Species living in more open habitats tend to favor very fast trills, while species living in more closed habitats, where reverb and reflections are produced by the sound being scattered by foliage and tree limbs, tend to favor slower, more tonal calls. This makes sense since, as Brown and Hanford point out, reverberation has the effect of blurring or smearing sounds together, and so it will mask the individual elements of any rapidly repeating pattern, meaning that these will therefore be less effective in long-range communication. Back to our Austrian. Even humans in mountainous areas have developed techniques such as yodeling to communicate across these spaces. People don't yodel just for fun, they yodel because of the acoustic nature of their habitat. You'll be relieved to hear that I'm not going to expose you to any yodeling in this presentation. Instead, would you like to have a guess at what this animal is? This is not, in fact, the sound of a bird, it's the sound of a torrent frog, in this case one from Brazil. Another way that an acoustic ecology is formed is through animals' adaptation to the geophony, which you'll remember is the sound produced by natural, non-biological causes, such as earthquakes, glaciers, or tides, or in this case, the presence of water. These are some spectrograms of recordings of concave-eared torrent frogs. These particular frogs live in the mountains and hills of two isolated regions of China and inhabit the vegetation that lives alongside rapidly flowing water streams. Because of the masking noise of the water, essentially quite loud white noise, these frogs have adapted to produce sound in the ultrasonic range, beyond the range of human hearing, at up to 128 kHz. On the other side of the world, the national bird of Norway, the white-throated dipper, which has a similar habitat, has also adapted in a related way, not with ultrasonic sound, but with very high-frequency song that cuts across the sound of the water. So we've seen in an acoustic ecology, both geography and geophony have an impact. What are the implications for game audio? In terms of understanding the geography of video games and its effect on the acoustic environment, we still have a long way to go. Many games still use a simple approach of putting a box around an area and applying a reverb effect to all sounds playing within that box. In the case of Unreal Engine, these are called audio volumes, or more recently, audio gameplay volumes. The audio middleware WISE enables us to create portals between these audio volumes or rooms and to control how sound diffracts and transmits through these portals. And there are ongoing developments with technologies such as Microsoft's Project Acoustics and Rob Bantin's work in the Snowdrop engine with reflections based on material types. But it's hugely complex and processing intensive. On the left is a GIF with a very simple illustration of a single sound source propagating in a room. Imagine the complexity of modelling this same sound source propagating through the rainforest on the right and the kind of calculations you'd need to get anything remotely accurate. So right now, audio designers are not working within an authentically accurate acoustic environment, making it difficult to hear and appreciate how the acoustics and geophony might impact on the kinds of sounds they decide to use. In terms of thinking about the geophony of a habitat, designers undoubtedly do think about the context within which their sound will sit, and there are some very valuable lessons from acoustic ecology that people have already learnt in the frequency domain. In any habitat, resources such as food and water will be limited, and if the species compete for the same resource in the same way, only one will survive. So species have evolved to exploit the resources available in different ways, so that they are not competing with each other. This is called resource partitioning. If we look at shoreline birds, these provide a useful metaphor. The food on a shoreline, the place where a body of water meets the land, is limited. So the birds in this habitat have evolved to have different length beaks or bills, so that they feed on different creatures that live at different depths in the sand. Different species of bumblebee do exactly the same thing, visiting different flowers that are best suited to the different lengths of their proboscis. If we flip the axis, we can see how we could relate this to the frequency spectrum. The frequency spectrum of audio is a limited resource, and particularly where the biophony is rich, this resource becomes scarce, so fauna need to find their place within it or be overwhelmed. From acoustic ecology, we can see that this is exactly what happens, in what Bernie Krause has termed the niche hypothesis. It's not in any animal's interests to be in audio conflict with another, since there's a disadvantage in doing so. So it makes sense that within a given biome, the sounds have evolved not to overlap. As you can see from these examples, each animal appears to occupy a unique bandwidth or niche within the frequency spectrum. Whether they explicitly refer to Krause and the niche hypothesis or not, it's clear that audio designers consider the same principles in their work. This is an excerpt from my discussions with the sound designer Ben Minto about his work on Star Wars Battlefront, and this is some audio from Endor in the game. Looking at Bert's original planet ambiences, you could see in the recordings that they match Krause's spectral niche idea, that he based them on real-world acoustic ecologies. For example, Tatooine has a North African influence, Hoth is essentially sounds from the Pacific Northwest, and Endor draws on the redwood forests around Skywalker Ranch. For the planet Solast in Star Wars Battlefront, which did not have an existing sound, I picked another ecology from the real world as a basis, that of coastal Chile. I researched and sourced sounds from this area and then imitated techniques that Ben Burt had used in his original work, for example taking these sounds and pitching them an octave up. Of course, the main problem is that games, like the world, are full of anthropogenic sounds, sounds that are produced by human activity. These sounds are produced by things that do not hear, that do not listen, and do not adapt to find their frequency band niche. One of the current solutions to this overcrowding of the audio spectrum is to use a system referred to as HDR, or High Dynamic Range Audio. This basically allows sounds to play if they fall within a specific window. When a loud sound plays, the window moves up and the system stops quieter sounds from playing. This makes the most of the limited dynamic range available, and the argument is that you wouldn't hear them anyway. This is a demo from Swedish Tech of their HDR plugin. Focus on the background ambience and the sounds of the vehicle and note how these drop away in the presence of loud sounds. The problem with current approaches is that they only assess sounds in terms of their amplitude. But in an acoustic ecology, sounds with the same amplitude can coexist because they are on different frequency ranges and so do not interfere or mask each other. This is a spectrogram of a recording I made in my back garden around dawn. I live in the valley below Leeds Bradford Airport, and so we can see some birds singing and a loud plane passing overhead. In a HDR system, the plane would likely mute the quieter birds, but in reality the birds are unaffected because they know they can still communicate since they are speaking in a different frequency range. In this next demonstration, we've developed a system that divides the sound into 7 frequency bands and monitors the amplitude within each band. In this ecology there are frogs, which are active in bands 4 and 5, and cicadas, which are active within band 7. When a new noisemaker appears in this environment, in this case a jet, we don't adopt a HDR approach, we don't mute the quiet sounds to give us more dynamic range. Instead, we only stop the sound from playing if the new sound is overlapping with their bandwidth. We've put a spectrogram into the level so you can clearly see this at the start of the video. Since the jet sound only conflicts with the frogs, only they stop, shown in red, but the cicadas are able to carry on. Once we have this system in place, we can undertake all kinds of other actions to reduce competition within the spectral domain. For example, we can learn from great tits who change the pitch of their calls when competing with traffic noise, or we could choose a different, less complex sound, or we could tighten a sound's bandwidth or its attenuations, the way that the sound falls off over distance, in order to maintain a more transparent mix. A recent game, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, adopts a related frequency-based approach to control the very crowded mix for this cooperative multiplayer game. In his GDC talk, principal sound designer Andrew Quinn explains how the bass sound of the weapons is sent to a bus along with other similar sounds like combat impacts and explosions. The resulting combined sound is sent as a sidechain into the multiband compressor that they developed. This then attenuates the music in any overlapping frequency bands, essentially notching out the music so that these sounds can better cut through. First, you'll hear the isolated music track and how the side-chained compressor is ducking some of the lower frequencies in response to the weapon fire. Then towards the end, you'll hear the full mix. It's clear that whether explicitly or through tacit knowledge and experience, audio designers think about the relative positions and relationships within the frequency spectrum of sounds, music and dialogue when designing games. And new techniques such as spectral HDR and spectral ducking could also help to deal with some of the issues that arise from complex mixes. Another approach is to think not only about the sounds themselves, but when they occur in time. As well as avoiding each other's acoustic territory in terms of frequency, fauna in rich acoustic ecologies also avoid sounding at the same time. This is referred to as temporal partitioning. The top image here represents an analysis of a dawn chorus in Mexico. The species are represented along the bottom x-axis, and the y-axis represents the time relative to sunrise. You can note how the birds have some overlap, but are generally vocal at different times. In another example of temporal partitioning or temporal distinction, Farina and Prioretti observed how the presence of an invasive species, the loud and very vocal red-billed leothrix, native to southern China, has had an impact on the native black-capped birds in northern Italy. There's a strong acoustic overlap between these two birds' calls, and the black-cap has been shown to have adapted by singing in the intervals between the red-billed leothrix's song. Taking a cue from film sound, audio director Rob Bridgett has written about how audio designers plan a scene or a period of gaming over time using what he refers to as tension curves. Referring to sound, music and voice as different food groups, he goes on to say, each line plots the intensity of each food group, and breaking into these separate streams can be useful when thinking about clarity in the mix, especially in determining and illustrating where there are intense musical moments, the voice moments, and sound moments in a mix. We're going to refer to this kind of large-scale planning of audio over time as a macro approach. Next, we're going to jump to look at how designers also think about timing in a very detailed way, which we'll refer to as temporal distinction on a nanoscale. Sound designer Andrew Quinn has kindly put together an example for us to share. This demonstrates how we might approach the sound design of a sniper rifle. First, you'll hear the individual elements that go into making the sound. You won't hear the LFE since we're not in 5.1. Then you'll hear a combined shot. And finally, you'll hear all the elements again, but how he would actually use them, separated in time in order to avoid everything fighting for bandwidth and dominance at the same temporal moment. If we look at how the temporal partitioning hypothesis might be applied to video game audio, we can see that a lot of these lessons are already in place. Timing is carefully considered both in the overall macro, long-term planning of a gaming episode and on the nano level of the individual sound elements. But what about on the micro level of individual sound events? It might seem obvious to control the timing of when sounds occur in order to minimize potential overlap, particularly in sounds that occupy similar spectral bandwidths. For ambient environmental sounds in games, most often coming from objects without a visible source, we could control this, but most systems currently don't. If we look at the systems for triggering randomized ambience in Unreal Engine, Wwise and Fmod, we can see that they all use a similar paradigm, that of re-triggering at a random time within a specified range. When we have a large set of fauna and other environmental sounds being triggered in this way, the chances of them overlapping becomes very high. By developing the system of monitoring certain frequency bands we used earlier, games could minimize or eliminate completely the chance of sounds with overlapping frequencies spawning simultaneously. In this final video demonstration, there are a number of frogs sitting around a pond. The frog shown in green is the one that's playing. Other frogs shown in yellow are cued to play at random times, but they are holding off because something in an overlapping band, in this case another frog, is already playing. Audio designers clearly understand the advantages of temporal distinction, and you can see them articulate and implement this both on a macro scene level and on the nano level of how they sequence the tiny transients and elements of sounds. There are, however, other opportunities to implement this approach on a micro level when it comes to ambient sound design, again leveraging new technologies that enable actors within the game to hear what other actors are doing. In summary, the audio mix is a contested territory in video games and in the world. In this talk, we've examined a number of aspects of acoustic ecologies, and we have seen how these are and are not reflected in video games. In terms of amplitude, we've discussed the Lombard effect, how animals get louder when the background noise increases. We've observed that actors within games do not actually listen, and so this phenomenon is generally absent. Then we showed how we could leverage new real-time audio analysis tools in order to implement this for a more authentic, immersive experience. In terms of space, we've recognized how acoustic ecologies are affected by the geography and acoustics of their habitat, as well as by its geophony. We've talked about how important these contexts are and how games might develop in future in terms of their representation of acoustic spaces. The niche hypothesis in the frequency domain is clearly understood by audio designers and forms part of their approach to achieving a transparent mix. But there are perhaps better ways in which we could implement HDR-type approaches. By looking to the frequency domain, we can allow non-overlapping sounds to coexist and use real-time analysis tools to carve out frequency notches where necessary. And finally, we've talked about conflicts and crowding in the time domain, looking at how acoustic ecologies avoid this through temporal partitioning, and how we could use audio analysis tools on a micro level in order to implement this for ambient soundscapes. There are no doubt many more ways in which we can learn from acoustic ecology, but the key lesson is that in order for an acoustic ecology to truly exist, we need something that has been missing in games up until now: actors that can actually hear. Here's our bibliography if you want to read some more about these topics. Finally, I'd like to give special thanks to sound designers Ben Minto and Andrew Quinn for their input to this talk. Thank you for listening.